Hello everyone, back again. Wanted to continue talking about Undisputed. Some people have asked me who was the channel that said that Terence Crawford was the only undisputed 140-pound champion in boxing. I don't remember. If I did, I would have called them out. But I clearly remember hearing that, and if I go through my history, maybe I'll find the channel. We'll see if I feel like it. But, maybe they misspoke. Maybe they meant to say the only 140-pound undisputed champion with all 4 belts, or the only undisputed champion in boxing today. Shit happens, right? I didn't think it was that important. It was a jumping off point for my video. And that wasn't even the point of the video, even though that was the title or the jumping off point thereof. The point was that, what? Undisputed is overrated. Unless it isn't. Alright? So, I know Bloodboxing made a video about Undisputed. And I don't have to watch the video because I already know what he's going to say. The guy's very predictable. But, Bloodboxing is one of those guys who's always shitting on the sanctioning bodies, right? When the sanctioning bodies are following the protocol and the rules and the contracts that people such as Guillermo Rigondeaux, one of the more recent examples, sign, right? He's shitting all over the sanctioning bodies. He's always criticizing their rankings and saying how they're bullshit, right? But then, because it's convenient, because his favorite fighters have been gifted with this undisputed bullshit, then he makes videos bragging about, who these undisputed fighters are and how important it is to be undisputed and blah, 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 right? So right after you criticize and discredit sanctioning bodies in one other video, you go on to talk about undisputed as if it meant something. Like, you're contradicting yourself. You're discrediting yourself, right? I mean, how are you going to criticize the WBA for following their own rules? How are you going to do that? And then, when it comes to criticizing sanctioning bodies for being bullshit and not following their rules of any contract, but just making shit up. Look, Guillermo Rigondeaux got stripped because he didn't fight his mandatories. Okay? That's why they stripped him twice. Because he didn't fight his mandatories. That's a fact. That's why he was stripped twice by the WBA. Fact. But then you're going to turn around and give Roy Jones Jr. credit for being undisputed and saying that he didn't have to go to Germany to fight this guy, without talking about the bullshit that the sanctioning bodies were actually guilty of. Look, I'm not saying that sanctioning bodies are perfect, but there's a time and a place to criticize them. Sometimes they're bullshit, sometimes they're not. But someone like Bloodboxing criticizes them when it's convenient for him and overlooks their bullshit when it's convenient for him because he's a fanboy. He's not an honest person. And he's full of double standards and bullshit. The kid is full of bullshit. Okay? I've talked about this in the past, but I'm going to rehash the Dariusz Michalczewski, Roy Jones Jr. situation because it's relevant. So you had Dariusz Michalczewski, the WBO title holder with a string of defenses, right? I believe he tied or beat all-time defense record with this WBO title. And at the time, WBO wasn't considered credible, right, by the other 3 sanctioning bodies, which is a double standard on their part because as soon as the IBF came into existence, the WBA and the WBC recognized it right away. The same year it came into existence. They just recognized it off the bat. But then when WBO came into existence, it took them, like a decade to recognize the WBO? And the WBO was credible because you had a Hall of Fame fighter, should be. The reason why he still isn't is that pro-American bias. But then you had a an all-time great fighter in Dariusz Michalczewski holding that title and proving that he was a worthy title holder because look, the first time he fought Montel Griffin, he beat him. He didn't need to fight him twice. He didn't lose to Montel Griffin like Roy Jones Jr. did he? Right? He beat Richard Hall, maybe not as impressively as Roy Jones Jr. Wait, Roy did beat him, didn't he? I'm pretty sure he did. But he beat him, and he beat him twice, right? Did Richard? Maybe I'm confusing. Glenn Johnson. No, I guess Roy didn't beat him, but Michalczewski, that is, also beat Virgil Hill, and he beat Hill when he was on top of the hill, right? Not coming off a loss. He beat him when he was the man. Virgil Hill was the lineal champion at light heavyweight and had 2 titles. So he beat him in a unification fight and beat his ass. Like, he beat his ass, right? He didn't stop him like Roy did, but Roy stopped him coming off a loss and over the hill already, right? He was no longer atop the hill. And maybe Michalczewski got him at the right time, but, if that's the case, Roy was just picking up scraps, wasn't he? So Michalczewski proved that he was the better light heavyweight because he didn't lose to Montel Griffin, and he beat Virgil Hill when Hill was on top of the heap, right? And he was the unified light heavyweight champion. He was the lineal champion. He was the man in the division. And the IBF and the WBA stripped him of both their titles using this excuse that he displayed their titles alongside the WBO title, right? When that wasn't in the rules, that wasn't in any contract, right? Because if it were, he wouldn't have done that. They just made this shit up as they went along to strip him of those titles, and then gave those titles to Roy Jones Jr., put him on the line with Roy fighting bums or over-the-hill fighters, right? Who did Roy fight for those titles? I don't know. Anyway, and another thing about credibility and sanctioning bodies. Look, when Roy Jones Jr. won his, or Michalczewski's IBF and WBA titles, right? When Roy Jones Jr. won those titles, he was displaying those titles with all kinds of titles, right? He would display them alongside the IBO, I believe, the WBI, or whatever the hell. Wait, let me see. IBA, IBO, WBF, right? He displayed his title with all kinds of other titles, and they didn't strip him, did they? So right then and there, you have these sanctioning bodies showing you how they're full of shit, and they are corrupt in that instance. And they're giving... And look, he fought fucking Mike McCollum way over the hill for the interim WBC title. Which was another problem with corruption in the WBC, sanctioning bodies, which was another bullshit. Because Rocky Gianni was someone who was supposed to be fighting for that title. And they bypassed them, basically. And Rocky Gianni almost bankrupted the WBC by taking them to court and suing the shit out of them and winning like $10 million or something like that, right? So that was a clear case of corruption, and the WBC in this case being bullshit. This wasn't the WBA following the rules and stripping Guillermo Rigondeaux, something that blood boxing and other people complain about so much, even though those were the rules, those were the contracts that people signed. But when they broke their own rules and they disrespected their own mandatory number one contender, right? He ain't talking about that. Why? Well, because Roy Jones Jr. is black and Rocky Gianni and Michalczewski are white. That's why. Right? But if you want to criticize sanctioning bodies for being bullshit, you have a perfect chance to do that. But no, he wants to hold up Roy Jones Jr. as an undisputed champion without qualifying that. He was a paper undisputed champion. He was never a true, right? He put some in his video as a true undisputed champion when he wasn't. He was a paper undisputed champion. He wasn't a true undisputed champion. Never. That's just a lie. But that's blood boxing for you, right? When he criticizes sanctioning bodies when they're following their own rules and doing what they're supposed to do, what they promised to do, and when they're respecting their mandatories, something that he says is it's important to fight your mandatories, and when it's convenient, he gives fighters credit like B-Hop for fighting his mandatories, right? But when other fighters ain't fighting their mandatories and they're getting stripped, oh, it's the WBA's fault. Not Rigondeaux, WBA. Anyway, you had, with this Michalczewski Roy Jones Jr. situation, you had the WBC, IBF, and the WBA. 3 sanctioning bodies showing you how corrupt and bullshit they are with their double standards, right? All to fuck over Michalczewski, who was the man in the division. He was the man. Not Roy Jones Jr., Michalczewski. That's a fact. He was the man to beat the man, and he had the better victories at light heavyweight. He did. At that time. He did. Because he didn't lose to Montel Griffin. He didn't need 2 tries to beat Montel Griffin. He beat his ass the first time. And he beat Virgil Hill when he was on top of the hill, right? Anyway, and then Roy, he fought for the interim title against Mike McCollum. And lost it to Montel Griffin, right? Regained it. And then he fought fucking Lou Del Valle for the WBA. I don't know how the WBA got put on the line. Did Del Valle win it from somebody? Probably did. After they stripped Michalczewski, yeah, Del Valle fought Eddie fucking Smulders for the vacant title, right? Vacant title, even though he was never vacated, but it was a vacant title, as if that meant something. So then he beat Lou Del Valle, a decent fighter and all, but not really anybody, for the WBA strap, and won the IBF against fucking Reggie Johnson with 5 losses. How did Reggie Johnson get that title? Reggie Johnson won that title against Will fucking Taylor. Woo, no, my bad. William Guthrie. That was a pretty good fighter and all. But who did Guthrie win it from? He won it from... Yeah, he won the vacant title against Darren Allen. The vacant title that was stolen from Michalczewski, right? So Roy Jones Jr. basically beat a couple of average fighters who won the vacant title, even though the champion never vacated the title but was stripped for displaying. I mean, can you have any more bullshit of a reason? I mean, these people are going to complain about Rigondeaux getting stripped for not fighting his mandatories, for not honoring his contracts, for not following the rules of these sanctioning bodies. They're going to complain and try to discredit the sanctioning bodies. But when it's time to really discredit them for the bullshit that they are, they don't do that. Why? Well, because Michalczewski is white and Roy Jones Jr. is black. And these guys are fucking Black Power Rangers, right? Race warriors. They're not honest people. So, but going back to this whole undisputed nonsense, Roy Jones Jr. won Michalczewski's titles, vacant titles, or he won them off average fighters who won them as vacant titles. And that's how he became undisputed, even though Michalczewski, those were Michalczewski's titles, rightfully so. He proved to be the better light heavyweight. He won them legitimately, and he was the lineal champion. He was the man to beat the man. He was the man in the division, right? He was the better light heavyweight. Proven. He was the proven light. It doesn't matter how you feel, how much you love Roy Jones Jr., or how excited all those wild swings he was throwing in the ring got you, and all those fixed fucking fights that he fought. None of that matters. How you felt about the man personally. What matters is the record. And on the record, Michałczewski was the man in the division. So how can you give Roy Jones Jr. all this credit for being undisputed when Michałczewski was the man and he was disputing Roy Jones Jr. reign? He was willing. Look, no one gets credit because the fights didn't happen. Nobody gets credit as if they beat somebody, right? We're not going to do that. But he was disputing Roy Jones Jr.'s claim because he wanted to come to U.S. to fight. They didn't pay him enough. You know, they put too many barriers, too many hurdles for him to jump. Like, they wanted him to fight 4 or 5 fucking fights in the U.S. before they let him fight Roy Jones Jr., or 3 or 4 fights. That's what they wanted him to do, right? Because they were going to rob him against some bum, and then Roy was going to fight that bum. But they wanted him to fight all these fighters before he got a chance to fight for his old titles against Roy. And he was willing to do that as long as they paid him enough money, because he was getting $1 million to fight a similar level of opponent in Germany. But they weren't willing to do that. But they offered a fight to Roy, and I believe they offered him, I forget right now, $5 million or something like that to go to Germany and fight the man in the division. And Roy didn't want to do that. So there was a dispute. Okay, I'm not blaming anybody here. I'm not saying that this guy gets credit because the other guy ducked him. No, all I'm saying is that there was a dispute in the division, and Roy Jones Jr. was not the man to beat the man. Michałczewski was, right? So just because you're undisputed doesn't even mean you're the best in your division. It doesn't. But then you go over to someone like Kovalev at the time, or Golovkin 2 or 3 years ago. And even though those guys didn't collect all the belts, right? They were undisputed. Nobody was disputing their reign. Nobody was disputing it. Billy Joe said, Golovkin beats me. When Golovkin had the 3 belts, Billy Joe capitulated. He said, I'm not going to fight him because he'll beat me, right? So Golovkin was the man in the division. He was the best fighter in the division. And then he beat Danny Jacobs, the number 2 middleweight. He became the lineal champion. He should have. I mean, I know they finagled the whole Canelo situation, but I already got into that. That was all bullshit. Canelo was not the lineal champion. He was not the man at middleweight. He never was. And, well, he was when he beat Miguel Cotto. He became that for a split second, right? But then he vacated the division. And when you vacate the division, twice he vacated the division, because he fought at 154, and then he fought at super middleweight also. So after you vacate the division, you vacate your lineal title. And Golovkin won that. So Golovkin was the man in the division. He was the lineal title holder. And he had the 3 titles, and he couldn't get to WBO because Billy Joe Saunders said, I'm not going to fight you because you're going to beat me. So he capitulated. He wasn't disputing anything. So even though on paper Golovkin wasn't undisputed, he really was, because nobody was disputing him. Nobody wanted to dispute Golovkin. Billy Joe Saunders capitulated. Chris Eubank Jr. was saying, I'm coming for you, while taking steps back and losing his pen, right? His mandatory, Tariana Johnson, sprung an injury out of nowhere when it was time to dispute. Nobody was disputing Golovkin. Just like Kovalev when he had the 3 belts. Nobody was disputing that. Adonis Stevenson didn't want to fight him. Adonis Stevenson, who was the man on paper in the division because he had beaten the lineal champion. He became lineal when he beat Chad Dawson. Right? He wasn't trying to dispute Kovalev. So for all intents and purposes, even though they weren't undisputed on paper, nobody was disputing the fact that they're the best fighter in the division. Especially with Golovkin, right? So Golovkin, for all intents and purposes, proved more at middleweight than Roy Jones Jr. did at light heavyweight. But Roy Jones Jr. is considered undisputed and Golovkin never was, right? So you can see how this, just because you're undisputed, that doesn't mean that you're even the man in your division, because that was Michalczewski. Roy wasn't even the number one light heavyweight in the world, but he was undisputed. You know what I'm saying? So just because you're undisputed, that doesn't mean shit. And one last thing for everybody, okay? Even though undisputed is basically a Western, for all intents and purposes, an American concept, right? American boxers have basically abandoned undisputed because, you know, they didn't want to fight each other. They didn't want to pay these sanctioning fees, what have you. Politics, whatever. They abandoned the whole concept. But now that Golovkin came in the game, that Kovalev came in the game, and they made it their quest to get all the belts, even though everything stood in their way, they made it their quest to become undisputed in their divisions, right? And by doing that, they proved that you could be a nobody, basically, an unknown from a foreign country, don't even speak English very well, if at all. You could come to America, and just by the virtue of the fact that you're willing to fight everybody, and you take on the tough fights, and you go after all the belts, you're gonna become a superstar like Golovkin, or pretty well known and well respected fighter like Kovalev, just by showing the willingness to fight everybody. And then the American promoters saw that happening, saw how the fans responded to Golovkin and Kovalev, and they started going after the undisputed once again, because it was these Eastern Europeans who once again breathed new life into the undisputed concept. And so someone like Terence Crawford is following in Golovkin's footsteps. Deontay Wilder doing a whole bunch of talking, not really pursuing what he's saying, but doing a whole bunch of talking. He's following in Golovkin's footsteps. Okay? All these American fighters talking about undisputed, and Terence Crawford finally being able to get it because of American privilege. Let's be real. They're following in Golovkin's footsteps, and it was the Eastern Europeans who breathed new life into the concept. And seeing how the fans responded to those guys, American promoters started to copy these guys. And that's what they're doing right now. And maybe you could say the same about Eddie Hearn and Anthony Joshua. We'll see what happens. But you know, it is what it is, and what it is politics and American boxing privilege. But you know what's really disgusting is these guys like 78 and Blood Boxing always lying and always bullshitting and always painting these black fighters like some kind of victims that they aren't, because Roy Jones Jr. was a protected, coddled, and a privileged fighter, just like Mayweather was, just like Deontay Wilder is. Okay, there's no racism in boxing, just like Terence Crawford is a protected and coddled fighter. These guys are privileged. They have it all their way. They could do whatever they want, right? And when these sanctioning bodies actually make some of these guys follow the rules because maybe they're not American and they don't have a lot of money, they don't bring a lot of money to the table, they actually enforce their own rules, like in the case of Guillermo Rigondeaux. All these guys all of a sudden want to pull the race card, and they want to bitch and moan, and they're begging for a handout. Blood Boxing, 78, and all these other racist Negroes out there, all they're doing is they're begging for a fucking handout for someone like Guillermo Rigondeaux, because they're used to Roy Jones Jr.'s, Terence Crawford's, and all these other fighters getting a fucking handout. When the people that are really screwed over are the non-American fighters, or the non-Mexican fighters for the most part. But that should be self-explanatory, because if these American fighters were to fight in Germany or Russia, we all know what would happen, right? It doesn't even have to happen. And maybe it wouldn't happen, but we all assume that they would get screwed over, right? And why do we assume that? Do we assume that because they go over there and get screwed all the time? No. We assume that because foreign fighters come to America and get screwed over all the time. And these dishonest piece of shit so-called boxing fans, but in reality, black tart fanboys like Blood Boxing and 78, All they do is bitch and moan about how the black fighter is underprivileged when he's the most privileged fighter, the American black fighter, not Jose Uzcategui. I don't know if he's black. He looked kind of black to me anyway, you know. And not necessarily Guillermo Rigondeaux. All they do is bitch and moan and make this shit up. And they reject the reality, as in the case of Michalczewski, who was the man in the division and was screwed because the sanctioning bodies that were, for the most part, American-based, preferred the dollar to the Deutschmark. You know what I mean? But they won't talk about that because it goes against their ideology. And their ideology is that of a fucking perennial victim. When in reality, they're the privileged ones. They're the racists, not everybody else that they point the finger at. They are the racists projecting their own racism. And it's clear and evident to see for anybody with the fucking brain. But anyway, Undisputed is overrated as fuck. It doesn't mean that you're the best in your division. Unless it does. And when a cruiserweight, be it Dortico or Gassiev or Usyk or Briedis, when that one cruiserweight finally wins the Undisputed Cruiserweight Championship, that's going to be the man, that's going to be the lineal champion, the undisputed champion, and that's going to be the man in the division that will have cleaned out the division legitimately. Okay? That's going to be credible. That's going to be real. That's going to mean something. But it doesn't seem like too many people are interested in all that, does it? Because once again, they're not the right skin color. Are they? Unless, of course, Dortico happens to win it. But he won't. And we all know that. Because Eastern Europeans are the best fighters in boxing right now. Or Europeans in general. And that's just a fact. And that's a fact that a lot of Americans have a very difficult time dealing with, because it's no longer a domestic American scene with the New York State Athletic Commission, or the WBA title, and the California State Athletic Commission title. It's a global scene, and the WBO, whether by design or by default, has been one of the best sanctioning bodies, one of the most credible sanctioning bodies, and one of the sanctioning bodies that should be respected the most, because it gave a chance to a lot of these fighters who were overlooked by the mainstream, by the establishment, by the WBA, WBC, and the IBF. IBF gets a little bit of credit too, because they've historically supported European champions. But the WBO has been that one sanctioning body that has basically allowed for the boxing scene to become a global boxing scene. Don't get me wrong, the WBC did a lot for the Latino fighters, and they get their props too, you know what I mean? But that's just the way the cookie crumbles, man. We need all these sanctioning bodies. Like it or not, we need all these sanctioning bodies. This is why we have 4 different belts, why it's more difficult and should be considered more credible to be undisputed in this era, with everything else being equal, obviously. It should be considered more credible to become undisputed in this boxing era, because it's a truly global era that, with the advent of and the establishment of these additional sanctioning bodies, it's become a more credible and a more difficult era of boxing, which is another reason why it's been more difficult to become undisputed. So, undisputed isn't all that it's cracked up to be, unless it is. And unless all of us keep it real, most of us will never understand the conversation and will be allowed to just bullshit their way through boxing, pretending to be boxing fans, when in reality, they're just racist trolls and fanboys. And we all know that this is true. But seeing as a lot of y'all have assumed this victim mentality, struggle you will. Thank you for listening. I'm out of here.